much for joining us for Higher Ed Matters. We're here to talk about your article that was recently published this past fall in Forbes that had a great title. Definitely caught my eye, right? 2023 was the worst year in the history of student search. Thanks for joining us to talk about this.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, for having me. Appreciate the invite.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about why you decided to write this article and where you found some of the data that supports your claim that it was the worst year.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, the background here, right, is that at CollegeVine, we partner with hundreds of institutions around the country to help them build their class and build their funnel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a trend that we had been noticing sort of on a kind of one-off, almost anecdotal basis is that a lot of our partners have been telling us, hey, search is something we've traditionally used to fill 30, 40, even 50% of our class. And it really hasn't been doing well for us the last couple of years. And that's something that we heard pretty consistently from individual partners whenever we asked them about it. And so for us, the thing that really sort of drove us to do the research and to publish the report that we did, in addition to the article that you saw on Forbes, was trying to answer this question systematically, right? Like, hey, how is search actually doing in the year 2023? Because I think for a lot of institutions and for a lot of higher ed, student search is almost considered a default, right? Like that's like the first thing you put onto the budget. That's like the first thing that you sort of put into a write-up of your recruiting strategy, right? Like student search is unimpeachable in the eyes of much of higher ed. And so, earlier this year, we had already published some research that looked at what's coming down the pike and some of the changes coming down to search with what we're calling the search cliff, where there's going to be about a 40% drop in senior name availability and as much as an 80% drop in sophomore and junior name availability over the next couple of years as the College Board shifts from paper to digital exams. So we were looking at that, and then we were kind of comparing that to the question of, or comparing that to the mindset of how most of higher ed thinks about student search. We said, hey, there's a bit of a mismatch here, right? There are some big negative changes coming down the pike. A lot of individual partners are telling us, hey, search isn't even doing that well for us in the first place. And so we wanted to kind of look at that systematically. So that was really the genesis for us of why we rewrote the article, why we did the research, why we published the report.
Excellent. It's so interesting that you bring up that search is kind of like that top line item in so many budgets. And really, I think that it's been years that it's not necessarily been producing the results it has for like a decade or more potentially. But I also think that the linear thought process of recruitment, that search was initially such a big part of enrollment marketing strategies, is also not hasn't been working for years. Like in terms of like asking a student to inquire, to give their information as a first step to all other recruitment activities is kind of antiquated too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think if you look at how much the student enrollment journey has changed since 2010, you can make an argument that it has changed more in the last 15 years and even in the last 5 years, especially kind of in this post-COVID period or sort of during the pandemic and right after the pandemic, than it did in the previous 30 or 40 years, right? From 1980 or from whenever, the first earliest predecessors of search and sort of mail marketing and enrollment management were put into place until the mid 2010s. There was not a lot of evolution there, right? It was a very standardized process. Maybe towards the tail end of that timeline, you started to see a little bit more shift from physical paper mail into email, right? But anyone who was a kid in the 90s or the early 2000s, or even the early 2010s, can sort of recount the mountain of mail that would show up on your door after you took the SAT or the ACT. And I think that because most of higher ed evolves really slowly, the fact that consumer behavior and ultimately at the end of the day, students who are going to enroll at your institution are consumers, consumer behavior has shifted far more rapidly than anything else in higher ed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has created some cognitive dissonance that higher ed is, I think, just starting to come out of, but it's not universal and it's not uniform.
Yeah. What is the kind of component of the change from a paper to a digital? Is it SAT that's switching from paper to digital?
It's the SAT and the College Board that's switching from paper to digital. So that's where you're going to kind of see the biggest impact.
And why is that? Why does that impact name availability?
Yeah. So it's a complicated story there, but the basics of it are that at the sort of last leg, right? A lot of SAT exams are delivered through school districts, right? What's called school day testing, whether that's a PSAT or a school day SAT. That's about 40% of all SAT test takers. Because of digital privacy laws that govern school districts in most of the states around the country, there's a couple of specific examples in New York and California that I think are like probably the most strict, but there are strict laws for much of the country. Mm-hmm. Students can no longer opt into search just by taking a school day SAT or PSAT exam. Mm-hmm. So that 40% pool of students is no longer going to be automatically enrolled into search. In order to enroll into search, they have to now engage with another College Board property and then specifically make it all the way through to your inquiry form before their contact information gets shared over.
Got it. Okay, perfect. So back to the article and the research that inspired it. How was the research conducted? Was it sort of qualitative, quantitative? How did you kind of dig the data up?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we looked at this, we wanted to really have a benchmark, right? It's one thing to say, here's how search has been doing in funnels, in sort of university funnels today, but without some sort of benchmark for what it was like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I think it's hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around what that actually means, right? And so what we ended up doing is we ended up looking at a 2018 report that was published by Ruffalo Noah Levitz that put together some benchmarks, that shared some benchmarks for funnel performance of student search names. And then what we looked at from there was, how can we construct a sample of universities that mirrors those institutions in terms of type of institution, right? A mixture of public, private, specialty, et cetera, regional public, you name it, we've got them within our cohort. How can we mirror that initial report in terms of yield as a benchmark, right? We want to make sure that we're looking at institutions that have comparable funnel statistics at the part of the funnel that are less affected by changes in student search. Mm-hmm. And so we pulled that all together, right? And we essentially ended up with a list of about 121 schools that we reached out to within our kind of client pool, and we got survey responses back from them on how search does at 4 very specific stages of conversion. So the first is converting from cold name into inquiry. The next is converting from an inquiry to an application. The next is admit rate off of that application. And then the final stage is yield. So we basically looked for those 4 variables because those were the 4 that were benchmarked by RNL back in 2018. And what we found is that the funnel performance for search has gotten about 2/3 worse. So in 2018, if you bought 100,000 names for the colleges in that sample, it turned into about 131 enrollments. Mm-hmm. In 2023, that same sort of purchase of 100,000 names turned into about 43 enrollments. So it's a huge drop off.
And it was really interesting to read too in your article to convert that those statistics into the dollar amount that it takes to recruit a search name essentially to your institution.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we like to encourage our partner institutions, but really all institutions to do, is actually run a direct and indirect cost analysis on each of your lead sources, right? Mm-hmm. So for search, that direct cost, right, which is if you take the cost per name and then you multiply it out through that sort of funnel performance, right? How much did you spend just on lead gen for each enrolled student? And in 2018, it was about $414. By 2023, that was about $1,200, right? Right. And then a good rule of thumb is that if you were to if you look at all the other costs, the cost of treatment, the cost of the allocated cost of your admissions officers and your staff. You add that all together, usually it's going to be about triple your lead cost, right? So the cost per enrollment for search as a lead source went from about $1,200 to about $3,600, which is, I think pretty expensive, candidly. And it's not clear that universities can afford that given all the other challenges they face.
Yeah, I totally agree. What do you think is still keeping colleges and universities thinking that they need to buy names in the six figures in order to make their class?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing is risk aversion, right? Like, there's the idea of like no one ever got fired for buying IBM, right? Like, because search is such a default understood behavior, right? You can buy search, have it fail, and no one's going to yell at you, right? Whereas if you try something new and it doesn't work, someone's going to say, why don't you just try search, the thing that's been working for us for 20 years? And oftentimes when you are at this moment of a sudden decline, right? Think like Kodak in 2008, right before digital cameras and cell phones, more importantly, really took the bottom out of that business, right?
Right.
When you're at that moment, it's really, really, really hard to take the plunge, right? To go out on a limb and take a risk. And I think, our framework and our perspective, right, is that search isn't doing well for you, but it still is a big lead source in an absolute sense, right? So our general advice to our partners has been, hey, don't kill search entirely, don't cut it entirely from your budget, but it's probably worth pulling some of the money that you're currently deploying into search very ineffectively, I might add, pull that money back and try some new sources out, try some new lead gen strategies out over the next couple of cycles, right? Especially because however bad search is for you today, it's about to get anywhere from 40 to 80% worse across the next 3 years.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. It's definitely just from a diversification of lead generation activities. It's such an interesting search as a concept in higher education. There's no other marketing industry out there that has that kind of record availability, right? Like that you would know exactly who and when and where a person is that is about to potentially buy your product, right? So it's one of those things that you do. There's probably a way to use those records smartly, but there's not a reason necessarily to, make it your only and your largest way of generating not just a lead, but an enrolled student.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the fundamental challenge with search is that the math just works against every institution that participates, right? Because we've gone from a world where, especially when, the SAT and ACT were more robust, and there were more students taking standardized tests when they were required by the majority of institutions. We've gone from a world where each student search name is purchased maybe like 30 or 40 or 50 times to a world where each name is purchased 200 times.
Right.
And that's true of any name provider, right? That's true, obviously, of the College Board and the ACT, but it's also going to be true of folks like, like Appley or Niche or whomever, right? Like anywhere you're buying cold names, chances are that name has been sold 250 other times, right? 250 other times. And so I think I agree with you, right? That there is still value in that sort of broad-based funnel approach. But you are increasingly fighting a losing battle if you're fighting at the level of a cold name, because fundamentally you've only got a 1 in 200 chance of being the school that student actually enrolls in, right? That's just what the math looks like.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what are potential solutions and strategies for colleges and universities moving forward in this sort of new version of search or funnel marketing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth maybe taking a quick step back to sort of lay out kind of what I think the reasons are for each of these funnel steps to grade, right? So I think when it comes to conversion to inquiry, what we've really identified as we've talked to students and as we've done sort of followed up our research is that it's largely about that competition, right? The fact that there's 200 other schools vying for the same set of eyeballs and the same attention, right? And the fact that the traditional treatment mechanisms are really, really ineffective, right? Like the average kid is going to get about 1,500 pieces of mail and email per year, right? Across their mailbox and their inbox, right? There's some students that get 5,000, right?
Right.
So it's just really, really hard to stand out in that sphere. And so that's largely what drives down conversion to inquiry. It's what drives down conversion to application. When you look at admit rate and deposit rate, I think one of the hidden factors that people haven't thought as much about is that the composition of who is actually within student search has shifted pretty remarkably with the advent of test optional policies.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not an accident that about 40% of students who are part of, say, College Board Search, for example, are school day test takers. Because what the College Board did, very smartly, I might add, right, is they went, as they saw this sort of decline in test taking start to emerge, they actually went to individual states, individual departments of education and said, hey, use the PSAT or use the SAT as your sort of standardized test for all 11th graders, not just for, CollegeVine kids who want to take that exam. And so what has ended up happening is that the sort of like college readiness of a large chunk of the students in student search from on the ACT side and on the College Board side, that has gone down, right? There's a lot of students who are not intending to attend a four-year college who are part of student search. And so you see that in terms of lower admit rates for search leads. You see that in terms of lower yield rates and frankly, lower retention rates when you run the analysis out a couple of years. And so if you hold that in the back of your head, when it comes to solutions and strategies for colleges, I think there's really a couple, right? The first is think about where you're bringing students into your funnel, right? Today, it's all about top of funnel. It's all about cold names. Mm-hmm. But what the data shows is that it's really, really hard to make that shift from cold name to really engaged student or applicant or admit. So think about bringing students that are sort of warmer leads, right? We like to call it mid-funnel lead strategies, and CollegeVine is one of those strategies, but there are others as well. Students that come in to a visit on campus, those are mid-funnel students, right? And you need to get to a point where more of your enrollment funnel is composed of those mid-funnel leads. I think that's the first piece. I think the second piece is figuring out how to make your communication and your marketing process feel more personalized. And I get that that's really, really tricky, right? Because by definition, as a school, especially if you're dealing with 400,000 names at the very top of your funnel, right? It's really hard to be personalized to 400,000 names. But when you look at something like, again, CollegeVine, I'm just going to use this because I know the data off the top of my head, right? On CollegeVine, you tend to need a 10th or a 20th of the lead volume to be able to generate the same enrollment results, right? So if you're using 400,000 search names, CollegeVine, our partners will tend to get the same results from anywhere from 10 to 20,000 connections on CollegeVine, right? And so in that world, you can be a lot more personalized. Mm-hmm. But it also requires you to sort of be operationally healthy and requires you to have a point of view on how you can leverage student data to personalize at scale.
Right.
So that'd be point number 2. And then I think point number 3 is what we talked about earlier, which is, hey, you gotta at least start diversifying now. It doesn't have to be cutting your entire search budget, but try out a couple of new lead sources for fall 25. See how they do, and then with the ones that do well, double down on that into fall 26 and beyond.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about how CollegeVine or any other ideas or strategies that you have, like you mentioned, leveraging the student data to achieve that personalization that you talked about at scale? How does CollegeVine allow you to do those kinds of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So easy way to understand CollegeVine is we are a professional recruiting network for high school students, sort of like LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. So the way it works is students will come in and they will build full professional profiles that contain everything from their background information, where they go to high school, their intended major, to grades, test scores, extracurricular activities, but also a really rich qualitative profile for what they're looking for out of their college experience, what type of campus environment they want to be on, what their financial situation looks like, right? So for our partners, at least, it's actually pretty easy to do personalization at scale because we've got a lot of data contained within student profiles and a lot of data that we sort of synthesize and ladder up to that our partners can deploy within their CRMs to personalize and to make their marketing comms more effective. Mm-hmm. And so with our model, right, the other piece that's really valuable for our partners is that the way it works for colleges is you're going to send out connection requests to students, either one-on-one or at scale. And then students are either going to say yes to that or ignore that. And then once that connection is formed on CollegeVine, we're going to populate that student into our partner CRMs, right? So the student is still ending up in their sort of recruiting infrastructure as what we call like a deep inquiry, right? Because those CollegeVine connections are going to apply at about a 20% rate.
Okay.
And the reason that rate is so high, I guess, is that students are limited in the number of connections that they can make. So they're pretty selective about who they choose to make a connection with. So what we've done is we've taken kind of the traditional sort of funnel and we've actually built that structurally into our platform. And for colleges, the way that the reason it's so valuable and so different than their other lead sources is because every CollegeVine connection that they make is already coming in at the middle of the funnel, right? They're going to apply at a 20% rate. They're pretty deep within your funnel.
Right.
And because you've got all this really valuable data, they're going to be warmer. They're going to have more affinity for your institution, and they're going to yield at better rates as well. I think our partners have seen about a 2x, about twice, 2 times the yield from their CollegeVine connections as they do from their traditional search cold name leads.
Okay. And so most of your partners that you work with are they also using sort of traditional search methods while also kind of working the middle of the funnel through CollegeVine?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a mix of all types, right? There are schools that work with us that use us alongside search, but there's also schools that have used us for a few years now and have decided, hey, let's pull way back on our search buys. Let's because we're getting the same impact from CollegeVine usually for like a third of the cost.
Right.
Or we're getting 3x the impact for the same cost. And so let's redeploy that to invest in our operation, to invest in our people, to invest in our marketing tools or our marketing support and resources. So I think it does depend, but yeah, most of our partners are at a stage where they're starting to think very seriously, hey, we probably don't need to be spending this much on cold names that don't add that much at the top of our funnel.
Right. But I think that the really interesting part about CollegeVine and working that mid-funnel is obviously you can, I believe, market to those students within the platform, but also have them within your CRM as far as your typical kind of outreach, your communication flow that starts from the point of an inquiry anyway. So you can kind of have some flexibility in how you reach that student.
Yeah, you're definitely getting the best of both worlds, right? You're getting the ability to kind of message them on the platform where they want to hear from you, but then you're also getting the ability to bring them into your traditional recruiting infrastructure, but with a bunch of additional data that you can use to personalize, right? Like one of the data points that you get for every student connection that you make on CollegeVine is that student's college persona. That's a default that comes in within with every student, and that's something that our partners use to make their existing marketing and comms feel way more personalized just by routing the correct message to the correct student.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Vinay, thanks so much for this great conversation. I think that you have some really good ideas, and I do believe I'm on the same message that the traditional search funnel is looking a little bleak, and colleges and universities definitely need to start to think about ways to pivot so that they can keep up with really the overall enrollment cliff. Right? We've got to do some things different to counteract the challenges ahead in enrollment.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me as a guest.
Absolutely.